On a Tuesday morning in New York City, when the cameras rolled for what seemed like another routine episode of The View, nobody expected that a single exchange would ignite a firestorm that would reshape the very foundation of daytime television. What started as a typical political debate between co-host Whoopi Goldberg and guest Pam Bondi quickly spiraled into something far more personal, far more devastating, and ultimately far more transformative than anyone could have imagined. The moment Whoopi launched her verbal attack, she had no idea she was about to come face to face with someone whose quiet strength would expose the hollowness of her own cruelty. What happened next didn't just leave Whoopi speechless. It changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The studio lights blazed with their usual intensity as makeup artists applied final touches to the hosts of The View. It was February 14th, 2024, and the show's producers had arranged what they thought would be a straightforward political segment, featuring former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi. The topic was routine immigration policy, something the show had covered countless times before. Whoopi Goldberg sat in her familiar spot at the table, reviewing her notes with the confidence of someone who had dominated this particular arena for over a decade. What none of them knew was that Pam Bondi had spent the previous night in a hotel, room 3 blocks away, not preparing talking points or rehearsing sound bites, but sitting beside her laptop on a video call with her elderly mother in Tampa. Her mother, Margaret, was in the final stages of Alzheimer's disease, and the woman, who had once been a sharp-minded federal prosecutor, now struggled to remember her own daughter's name. The irony wasn't lost on Pam that she was about to discuss family values on national television, while watching her own family slowly disintegrate through a disease that showed no mercy. Pam had been working in relative obscurity since leaving public office, running a small legal aid clinic in Clearwater that specialized in helping elderly victims of financial fraud. The work paid barely enough to cover her mother's medical expenses, but it gave her something that politics never had, a sense of genuine purpose. She took cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch, representing seniors who had lost their life savings to scam artists, fighting insurance companies that denied legitimate claims, and spending her own money when clients couldn't afford basic legal fees. The invitation to appear on The View had come through her literary agent. Pam had quietly written a memoir about her experiences caring for her mother while trying to maintain her legal practice, and the book had gained unexpected attention from readers who found themselves in similar situations. The publisher thought a television appearance would boost sales, and Pam reluctantly agreed, knowing that every dollar in royalties could extend her mother's care for another week. As she sat in the green room that morning, Pam wasn't thinking about political battles or public image. She was thinking about the phone call she'd received at 6 a.m. from her mother's nurse, explaining that Margaret had experienced another difficult night, repeatedly asking for her deceased husband and becoming agitated when reminded he wasn't coming home. These were the moments that politics never prepared you for. The quiet devastations that happened in fluorescent-lit hospital rooms while the world moved on without notice. Whoopi Goldberg, meanwhile, was in an entirely different headspace. She had spent the weekend at her estate in New Jersey, hosting a dinner party for several prominent Democratic donors who had been pressuring her to be more aggressive in her political commentary. The message was clear. Nice wasn't working anymore, and the show needed more fire if it wanted to maintain its relevance in an increasingly polarized media landscape. Whoopi had built her career on being the voice that said what others wouldn't, and she felt the familiar rush of anticipation that came before delivering what she knew would be a memorable moment. The makeup artist finished applying Whoopi's foundation as she scrolled through her phone, reading the latest political headlines and finding fresh ammunition for the upcoming segment. She had done her research on Pam Bondi, focusing primarily on controversial decisions from her time as Attorney General, and she felt confident that she could expose what she saw as the hypocrisy of conservative politicians who claimed to care about families while supporting policies that hurt ordinary Americans. What Whoopi hadn't researched was the human being behind the political resume. She didn't know about the legal aid clinic, the sleepless nights, or the fact that Pam had turned down 3 lucrative corporate law positions to stay close to her mother. She didn't know that Pam had been secretly covering the medical expenses of 2 other elderly clients whose families couldn't afford proper care. She saw only a target, a representation of everything she opposed politically, and she prepared to take aim with the precision of someone who had perfected the art of public humiliation. The show's opening segments proceeded normally. Joy Behar delivered her monologue, Sarah Haynes discussed a light-hearted cultural topic, and the co-hosts engaged in their typical banter. The audience was warm and responsive, filled with tourists and longtime fans who had waited months for tickets. The energy in the studio was electric, as it always was when the cameras rolled, and millions of viewers tuned in for their daily dose of commentary and controversy. Pam Bondi was introduced to polite applause, taking her seat across from the panel with the composed demeanor of someone who had appeared on countless television programs over the years. She wore a simple navy blazer and pearl earrings, her appearance professional but understated. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, though those watching closely might have noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the barely perceptible tightness around her eyes that comes from carrying a burden too heavy to set down. The first few minutes of the interview proceeded predictably. Questions about immigration policy, border security, and federal-state cooperation. Pam answered thoughtfully, avoiding inflammatory rhetoric and focusing on practical solutions. She spoke about the need for compassion in law enforcement, the importance of treating immigrants with dignity, and the challenges facing communities on both sides of complex issues. Her responses were measured, nuanced, and surprisingly empathetic for someone with her political background. Whoopi listened with growing impatience. This wasn't the combative conservative firebrand she had expected to face. Pam's reasonable tone and genuine concern for human welfare was making it difficult to create the confrontational television moment that Whoopi had been building toward. She could feel the producers in her earpiece urging her to push harder, to find the angle that would generate the clips and social media buzz that kept the show relevant. As the interview moved into its second segment, Whoopi's frustration became more apparent. She interrupted Pam's responses, challenged every statement with increasingly aggressive follow-ups, and began to inject personal attacks into what had started as a policy discussion. The other co-hosts watched with growing discomfort as the tone shifted from professional disagreement to something that felt personal and cruel. The moment that would change everything came when Pam mentioned her work with elderly victims of fraud. She was explaining how immigration policy affected vulnerable senior citizens who were often targeted by scammers, speaking from her direct experience at the legal aid clinic. Her voice carried the quiet passion of someone who had seen real suffering and was trying to prevent others from experiencing the same pain. Whoopi leaned forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the smile of a predator who had finally found the weakness she was looking for. She had noticed the slight catch in Pam's voice when she mentioned elderly victims, the way her hands had tightened almost imperceptibly when discussing families torn apart by fraud. Something about this topic was personal, and Whoopi sensed an opportunity to strike where it would hurt most. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The studio fell silent as Whoopi prepared to deliver what she intended to be the killing blow. The audience could feel the shift in energy, the way the air becomes heavy before a storm breaks. Cameras zoomed in on both women, capturing every micro-expression, every tell that would be analyzed and replayed countless times in the hours to come. Whoopi's voice carried the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to wielding words like weapons. She didn't raise her voice or show obvious anger. Instead, she deployed the kind of cutting sarcasm that was her trademark, the ability to destroy someone while smiling, to inflict maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. She questioned Pam's sincerity, mocked her claims of caring about vulnerable populations, and suggested that her legal aid work was nothing more than a publicity stunt designed to rehabilitate her image after leaving politics. But then, Whoopi went further. With the instinct of someone who had spent years finding people's pressure points, she began to attack Pam's credibility as an advocate for the elderly. She suggested that someone who had spent years in politics couldn't possibly understand real suffering, couldn't genuinely care about ordinary people's problems. Her words were carefully chosen to sound like legitimate criticism while carrying the unmistakable message that Pam Bondi was a fraud, a calculating politician pretending to have a conscience. The attack might have landed on a different day, against a different person. But Whoopi had no way of knowing that she was speaking to someone who had spent the previous 6 months watching her mother forget her face. Someone who had liquidated her retirement savings to pay for experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. Someone who had been up until 3 a.m. the night before researching memory care facilities because the disease was progressing faster than anyone had expected. Pam listened to the accusations with the kind of stillness that comes from being hollowed out by grief, the calm that settles over someone who has already lost everything that truly matters. She didn't flinch at Whoopi's words because they couldn't touch the place where her real pain lived. Political attacks seemed trivial compared to watching someone you love disappear piece by piece, their personality and memories dissolving like sugar in rain. When Whoopi finished her assault, clearly expecting either a defensive response or a complete breakdown, the studio remained silent. Pam sat quietly for a moment, her eyes focused on some point beyond the cameras. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but carried a weight that seemed to compress the air in the room. She didn't defend her record or cite her accomplishments. She didn't attack Whoopi's credibility or question her motives. Instead, she began to speak about her mother, not as a political talking point or a way to gain sympathy, but as a daughter who was losing the most important person in her world and didn't have the luxury of pretending that anything else mattered. Pam's voice remained steady as she described, watching a brilliant woman, a former federal prosecutor who had argued cases before the Supreme Court, reduced to asking the same question every 5 minutes because her brain could no longer form new memories. She spoke about the gut-wrenching decision to place someone you love in a facility because you can no longer keep them safe at home, about the financial devastation that comes with trying to provide quality care in a system that treats dignity as a luxury good. She talked about the elderly clients at her legal aid clinic who reminded her of her mother, victims of scams who had lost not just their money, but their trust in other human beings. She described staying up nights reviewing cases for free because someone's grandmother had been convinced to send her social security check to a fake charity, about the quiet rage that comes from watching predators target the most vulnerable members of society. As Pam spoke, something extraordinary happened in the studio. The usual background noise of television production, the shuffling of papers, the whispered conversations between crew members, the constant electronic hum of equipment, all of it faded into complete silence. Even the audience, typically responsive and engaged, sat absolutely still, The only sound was Pam's voice, measured and quiet, carrying a truth that cut through all the performance and artifice of television. Whoopi, who had built her career on having the last word, on dominating every conversation she entered, found herself completely speechless. Not because she had been outmaneuvered or out-argued, but because she was confronting the reality of what she had just done. She had attempted to humiliate someone who was already carrying more pain than any person should have to bear. She had tried to score points by attacking someone whose worst day was worse than anything Whoopi had experienced in her comfortable, successful life. The cameras captured every second of Whoopi's realization. Her face went through a series of micro-expressions, confusion giving way to understanding, understanding giving way to horror, and horror giving way to something that looked very much like shame. She opened her mouth several times as if to speak, but no words came. For the first time in decades of television, Whoopi Goldberg was rendered completely mute by the weight of her own cruelty. Pam finished speaking and simply sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't waiting for applause or validation. She had spoken her truth not to win an argument or create a moment, but because Whoopi's attack had cracked something open inside her, and the words had spilled out like water from a broken dam. She looked tired, not just from the confrontation, but from carrying the burden of watching someone she loved slip away while trying to help others avoid the same devastation. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Television, which abhors dead air above all else, ground to a halt as everyone in the studio grappled with what they had just witnessed. This wasn't the usual political theater that viewers expected from The View. This was something raw and real and uncomfortable in a way that made entertainment feel obscene. Finally, one of the other co-hosts attempted to break the tension by moving to a commercial break, but even her voice sounded uncertain, as if she wasn't sure whether continuing the show was appropriate or possible. The cameras pulled back, to wide shots that seemed to emphasize how small and isolated both women looked at the table, surrounded by the elaborate set that suddenly felt like nothing more than expensive wallpaper covering something much more serious underneath. During the commercial break, Whoopi didn't move from her chair. She stared at her hands, occasionally glancing up at Pam, who was checking her phone for messages from her mother's care facility. The other hosts tried to make conversation, to restore some normalcy to the situation, but their words sounded hollow against the weight of what had just happened. The studio audience sat in uncomfortable silence, unsure whether they had witnessed great television or something they shouldn't have seen at all. When the show returned from commercial, Whoopi's entire demeanor had changed. The aggressive confidence that had characterized her earlier attacks was gone, replaced by something that looked very much like a person trying to figure out how to apologize for the unforgivable. She started to speak several times, her voice catching on words that wouldn't come. The woman who made her living through verbal precision found herself linguistically helpless when confronted with genuine human suffering. Pam, meanwhile, seemed to exist in a different space entirely. She answered the remaining interview questions with the same measured thoughtfulness she had shown earlier, but there was something different about her presence now. She had revealed something essential about herself, had spoken truth in a place designed for performance, and the experience seemed to have both exhausted and liberated her. The interview concluded with handshakes that felt more like a funeral receiving line than a television farewell. Whoopi's usual confident closing remarks were replaced by stumbling attempts at civility that fooled no one. The audience applauded, but it was the polite, uncertain applause of people who weren't sure what they were supposed to appreciate. As Pam gathered her belongings and prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. A woman in the front row of the audience stood up. She was elderly, probably in her 70s, with silver hair and the careful movements of someone managing arthritis. She began to clap, slowly and deliberately, and her applause had nothing to do with entertainment or politics. It was the recognition of one person who understood suffering, acknowledging another. One by one, other audience members began to stand. Not all of them, and not quickly, but enough to create a moment that had nothing to do with the usual rhythms of television production. These were people who had watched someone they loved disappear into dementia, who had struggled with insurance companies and medical bills, who had felt the particular helplessness that comes from being unable to protect the people you care about most. Pam looked out at the faces in the audience and saw her own experience reflected back at her. These weren't political supporters or opponents. They were people who understood that some truths transcend ideology, that some struggles are universal regardless of party affiliation or policy preferences. She nodded slightly in acknowledgement, a gesture so subtle that the cameras barely caught it, but it carried the weight of recognition between people who had walked similar paths. As she left the studio, Pam passed by the green room where other guests waited for their segments. A production assistant mentioned that her phone had been ringing constantly during the interview, that her publisher was already getting calls from news outlets wanting to book follow-up appearances. The television moment was becoming a media event, and everyone wanted to capitalize on the authentic emotion that had broken through the usual artifice of daytime TV. But Pam wasn't thinking about media opportunities or book sales. She was thinking about her mother, about the phone call she needed to make to check on how the morning had gone, about the physical therapy sessions scheduled for that afternoon that she might still be able to attend if she caught the next flight. Back to Tampa, the television appearance, which had seemed so important when she agreed to it, now felt like a distraction from the things that actually mattered. Whoopi remained in the studio long after the show ended, sitting alone at the table while the crew broke down equipment around her. She played the interview over in her mind, trying to understand how she had so completely misjudged the situation. She had expected to face a political opponent, and instead had encountered someone whose pain made all her usual tactics seem petty and cruel. The realization was uncomfortable in a way she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in her career, Whoopi found herself questioning not just what she had said, but who she had become. The woman who had built her reputation on speaking truth to power had used her platform to attack someone who was already powerless, someone who had sacrificed everything she valued to care for a dying parent. The irony was bitter and inescapable. The video clips from the interview began circulating online within hours. But unlike the usual political content that generated temporary outrage and quick forgiveness, this footage had a different quality. Viewers watched not for partisan validation, but for something more essential, a reminder that real human struggles exist beyond the manufactured conflicts of television news. Comment sections, usually filled with predictable political arguments, instead became spaces where people shared their own stories of caring for aging parents, of watching loved ones disappear into disease, of feeling abandoned by systems that promised help but delivered bureaucracy. Pam's words had created an opening for conversations that politics usually prevents, moments of genuine human connection in a medium designed to divide. What none of them knew yet was that this television appearance, which had started as a simple book promotion, was about to become something much more significant. Pam's quiet honesty about her mother's condition and her work with elderly fraud victims had touched something in viewers that transcended political affiliation. The phone calls to her publisher weren't just from news outlets looking for follow-up stories. They were from people who wanted to help, who had resources to offer, who had been waiting for someone to acknowledge that caring for aging parents was a crisis that affected everyone regardless of politics. A retired physician in Seattle had called to offer free consultations for Alzheimer's families. a non-profit organization in Denver, wanted to fund a legal aid clinic specifically for elderly fraud victims. A technology company in Silicon Valley was developing an app to help families coordinate care for loved ones with dementia, and they wanted Pam's input on making it accessible to people who couldn't afford expensive solutions. But perhaps most importantly, 3 major insurance companies had reached out to discuss policy changes that would better cover the kind of experimental treatments that families like Pam's were funding out of pocket. The authenticity of her televised moment had created something that years of political advocacy hadn't achieved, a genuine conversation about solutions rather than problems. As Pam sat in the airport waiting for her flight home, she checked her voicemail and found dozens of messages from strangers who had watched the interview and wanted to share their own stories. A daughter in Ohio, whose mother had been scammed out of her retirement savings, a son in Texas who was bankrupting himself trying to pay for his father's memory care, a woman in Maine who had given up her career to become a full-time caregiver and felt completely invisible until she heard Pam speak. These weren't political messages or fan mail. They were communications from people who had been carrying their struggles in isolation, who felt heard for the first time in years. Pam realized that her moment of vulnerability on national television had accidentally created something she never intended, a community of people who understood that some challenges are too big for any individual to face alone. The flight back to Tampa gave her time to process what had happened. She had gone to New York to promote a book, and instead had experienced something that felt more like a confession or a prayer. She had spoken truth in a place designed for performance, and somehow that truth had created space for others to be honest about their own struggles. When she finally arrived at her mother's memory care facility, Margaret was having one of her clearer days. She recognized Pam immediately and asked about her trip to New York. Pam started to explain about the television show, but her mother's attention had already drifted to the flowers visible through the window. These moments of connection were becoming rarer, precious fragments of the person Margaret used to be, appearing and disappearing like sunlight through moving clouds. As Pam sat holding her mother's hand, she thought about Whoopi's stunned silence, about the audience members who had stood to applaud, about the voicemails from strangers who had found courage in her words. She hadn't intended to create a movement or start a conversation. She had simply told the truth about what it felt like to watch someone you love disappear while trying to help others avoid similar devastation. But sometimes truth has its own momentum, creating ripples that spread far, beyond the moment when it's first spoken. And sometimes those ripples become waves that change everything they touch, including the person who first disturbed the water. The real transformation was just beginning. The morning after the interview, Whoopi Goldberg woke up in her Manhattan penthouse to find her phone buzzing with notifications she had never seen before. Not the usual political commentary or entertainment gossip, but thousands of messages from viewers who had watched the previous day's episode and felt compelled to respond. As she scrolled through the comments, a pattern emerged that made her stomach clench with recognition. These weren't angry political rants or supportive fan messages. They were personal stories, raw confessions from people who had been carrying burdens similar to Pam Bondi's. A retired teacher from Michigan had written about watching her husband disappear into dementia while fighting their insurance company for coverage of his medications. A construction worker from Georgia described taking a second job to pay for his mother's memory care after she was scammed out of her life savings by fake charity workers. A nurse from Oregon had shared her experience of choosing between her career and caring for her father, ultimately leaving medicine to become a full-time caregiver because professional help was financially impossible. Each message carried the same undertone of gratitude, not for Whoopi's performance, but for Pam's willingness to speak honestly about struggles that most people faced in private shame. The viewers weren't praising the confrontation or the dramatic television moment. They were thanking someone for finally acknowledging that the sandwich generation, those caught between caring for aging parents and supporting their own families, had been fighting an impossible battle without recognition or support. Whoopi found herself reading every message, unable to stop, even as the pattern became clear and painful. She had spent her career believing that her role was to challenge power, to speak for the voiceless, to use her platform to defend those who couldn't defend themselves. But in attacking Pam Bondi, she had done the opposite. She had used her considerable influence to mock someone who was already sacrificing everything to care for the vulnerable, someone who represented exactly the kind of person Whoopi claimed to champion. The irony was inescapable and bitter. While Whoopi had been comfortable in her wealth and celebrity, assuming moral superiority based on political positions rather than personal actions, Pam had been quietly living the values that Whoopi only talked about. The legal aid clinic, the elderly fraud victims, the personal financial sacrifice to care for a dying parent. These weren't political talking points or image management strategies. They were the daily reality of someone who had chosen service over success, compassion over comfort. 3 days after the interview, Whoopi made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She cancelled her weekend plans, dismissed her usual entourage of assistants and advisors, and drove alone to Clearwater, Florida. She hadn't called ahead or arranged a meeting. She simply looked up the address of Pam's legal aid clinic and decided that some conversations couldn't happen through representatives or scheduled appearances. The drive gave her time to think about how drastically she had misjudged not just Pam Bondi as an individual, but the entire situation she was facing. Whoopi had assumed that someone with Pam's political background couldn't genuinely care about ordinary people's problems, that any charitable work was simply career rehabilitation, designed to soften a harsh public image. She had been so committed to her political assumptions that she had ignored the human being sitting across from her. When Whoopi arrived at the legal aid clinic, she was struck by how different it was from what she had expected. The office was located in a strip mall between a discount grocery store and a check-cashing business, the kind of unglamorous location that suggested genuine commitment rather than publicity seeking. The waiting room was filled with elderly clients, many of whom looked exactly like the fraud victims Pam had described on television. Whoopi sat in her car for nearly an hour, watching through the window as Pam worked with clients. There was no camera crew, no media attention, no audience to impress. Just a lawyer who had given up lucrative opportunities to help people who couldn't afford proper legal representation. Whoopi observed the careful attention Pam paid to each client, the way she listened to their stories with patience and respect, the obvious care she took to explain complex legal concepts in terms that made sense to people who felt overwhelmed by bureaucracy. When Whoopi finally gathered the courage to enter the clinic, Pam looked up from her desk with surprise, but no, anger. She had been reviewing a case involving an 80-year-old veteran who had been convinced to sign over his disability benefits to a fake investment company, and her desk was covered with financial documents and legal briefs. The work was clearly consuming, requiring the kind of detailed attention that left no energy for grudges or theatrical emotions. The conversation that followed was unlike any Whoopi had experienced in decades of public life. There were no cameras, no audience, no performance expectations, just two women sitting in a small office decorated with children's drawings from grateful grandchildren, talking about the gap between public perception and private reality. Pam didn't lecture or condemn. She simply shared the daily details of running a clinic that operated on donations and good intentions, of representing clients whose cases would never generate fees large enough to sustain a traditional law practice. Whoopi learned about the scope of elder fraud in a way that statistics and news reports had never conveyed. Pam walked her through actual case files, with names and details redacted, but the human cost devastatingly clear. Seniors who had lost not just money, but their sense of security, their trust in other people, their belief that the world contained more good than evil. Families torn apart by financial stress and the shame of being victimized. Children forced to choose between their own financial stability and their parents' care. The most difficult part of the conversation came when Pam explained the personal cost of her work. She showed Whoopi the spreadsheet where she tracked her mother's medical expenses, the careful calculations required to balance experimental treatments against available resources. She described the phone calls from debt collectors, the credit, cards maxed out to pay for medications that insurance wouldn't cover, the constant anxiety about what would happen when the money ran out. Whoopi realized that while she had been comfortable in her Manhattan penthouse, debating policy in the abstract comfort of television studios, Pam had been living the reality that millions of American families faced every day. She wasn't representing elder fraud victims as a political gesture or career move. She was one medical bill away from becoming a victim herself, someone whose love for her mother had led her to the edge of financial ruin. As the afternoon progressed, Whoopi began to understand the complexity of Pam's situation in a way that her television research had never revealed. The legal aid clinic wasn't just charitable work. It was a lifeline for people who had been abandoned by systems that promised protection but delivered bureaucracy. The elderly clients weren't abstract victims of societal problems. They were individuals whose stories reflected the vulnerability that everyone would face if they lived long enough. When Pam excused herself to take a call from her mother's care facility, Whoopi was left alone with the case files and legal documents that represented the daily reality of elder abuse in America. She read about seniors who had been convinced to drain their retirement accounts for fake lottery winnings, grandparents who had sent thousands of dollars to scammers claiming their grandchildren needed bail money, elderly immigrants who had been targeted because of language barriers and cultural isolation. The scale of the problem was overwhelming, but what struck Whoopi most forcefully was the intimate nature of each case. These weren't statistics or policy talking points. They were individual tragedies that had destroyed families and shattered the final years of people who had worked their entire lives for security and dignity. Each file represented someone's parent or grandparent, someone who had trusted the wrong person at a moment when cognitive decline made them vulnerable to manipulation. When Pam returned from her phone call, her face was pale with worry. Her mother had experienced another decline, becoming agitated and refusing to eat. The care facility was recommending a medication adjustment that would cost an additional $300 per month, money that would require Pam to take on additional clients or find another source of income. The conversation brought the abstract discussion of elder care into sharp focus, reminding both women that behind every policy debate were real people facing impossible choices. Whoopi found herself asking questions she had never considered before. How did families navigate the maze of insurance coverage and Medicare limitations? What happened to elderly people who had no family members able to advocate for them? How did the legal system handle cases where victims had limited cognitive capacity to participate in their own defense? The questions revealed the depth of her ignorance about issues that affected millions of Americans. Pam answered each question with the detailed knowledge of someone who had been forced to become an expert in areas she had never expected to encounter. She explained the catch-22 of Medicare coverage, which required patients to demonstrate improvement in order to continue receiving benefits, making it nearly impossible for people with progressive conditions like Alzheimer's to maintain consistent care. She described the legal challenges of representing clients whose memory problems made them unreliable witnesses in their own cases. The conversation stretched into the evening as other staff members finished their work and left the clinic. Whoopi and Pam found themselves alone in the small office, surrounded by the detritus of legal work that would never generate headlines or recognition. The fluorescent lighting was harsh and institutional, nothing like the carefully designed sets where Whoopi usually conducted her conversations, but the environment seemed to encourage a different kind of honesty. As they talked, Whoopi began to understand how her attack during the television interview had been not just unfair, but fundamentally ignorant. She had criticized Pam for claiming to care about vulnerable populations while having no understanding of what that care actually required. She had questioned the sincerity of someone who had literally impoverished herself to help others, someone who worked 18-hour days for clients who could never repay her efforts. The realization was humbling, in a way Whoopi hadn't experienced since her early days in entertainment, when failure was still possible and success wasn't guaranteed. She had spent decades insulated by wealth and celebrity from the struggles that ordinary people faced, and that insulation had made her arrogant in ways she was only beginning to recognize. Her political positions, however sincere, were theoretical, constructs that had never been tested against personal sacrifice or genuine hardship. When Pam offered to show her the memory care facility where her mother lived, Whoopi accepted the invitation with trepidation. She had never spent time in such places, had never confronted the reality of what aging looked like for people without resources to buy privacy and comfort. The drive to the facility was quiet, both women lost in their own thoughts about the gulf between public rhetoric and private reality. The memory care facility was clean and well-maintained, but institutional in a way that no amount of decorating could disguise. The residents wandered the hallways with the careful supervision of overworked staff members who clearly cared about their charges, but were overwhelmed by the demands of their jobs. Whoopi watched as Pam greeted the nurses by name, asking about specific residents and demonstrating a familiarity that spoke to countless visits and genuine relationships. Meeting Margaret Bondi was perhaps the most transformative moment of Whoopi's visit. The woman who had once been a federal prosecutor was now confused and frightened, asking repeatedly for her deceased husband and becoming agitated when reminded that he wasn't coming to visit. Whoopi watched as Pam sat patiently with her mother, answering the same questions over and over without showing frustration or impatience. The interaction revealed something about Pam that no political resume could capture. She possessed a kind of grace under pressure that had nothing to do with media training or public relations strategy. She had learned to find meaning in moments that would have driven other people to despair, to maintain hope in a situation that offered no possibility of improvement. Her love for her mother wasn't sentimental or performative. It was practical and enduring, expressed through daily actions rather than grand gestures. Whoopi left Florida that night with a completely different understanding of the woman she had tried to humiliate on national television. But more than that, she left with a different understanding of herself and the ways in which her privilege had blinded her to realities that millions of Americans navigated every day. The drive back to New York gave her time to process the gap between her public persona as a champion of the underdog and her actual knowledge of what being an underdog really meant. The following week, something unprecedented happened on The View. Whoopi opened the show not with her usual monologue or political commentary, but with an apology. Not the typical celebrity non-apology that took responsibility while shifting blame, but a genuine acknowledgement of error that left her visibly emotional. She described her visit to Florida, her education about elder fraud and dementia care, and her realization that she had attacked someone who represented everything she claimed to value. But the apology was only the beginning of what would become a much larger transformation. Whoopi announced that she was using her platform to launch an investigation into elder fraud, bringing the same energy she had previously devoted to political attacks to exposing the scam artists who targeted vulnerable seniors. She promised to use her show's resources to educate viewers about warning signs, to connect victims with legal resources, and to pressure lawmakers to strengthen protections for elderly Americans. The announcement surprised everyone who knew Whoopi, including her co-hosts and the show's producers. This wasn't the kind of content that generated viral clips or political controversy. It was serious journalism focused on unglamorous problems that affected people who weren't typically considered television-worthy. But Whoopi had been changed by her encounter with Pam Bondi in a way that made her previous concerns about ratings and relevance seem shallow and meaningless. Over the following months, The View began to feature segments that no one could have predicted. Interviews with elder fraud investigators, demonstrations of common scam techniques, profiles of legal aid clinics that needed funding and volunteers. Whoopi used her celebrity connections to bring attention to issues that had previously been ignored by mainstream media, leveraging her influence in ways that created real change rather than temporary outrage. The transformation wasn't easy or immediate. Whoopi had to learn an entirely new vocabulary, develop relationships with experts in fields she had never considered, and admit ignorance about subjects she had previously approached with casual confidence. She spent weekends visiting memory care facilities and legal aid clinics, not for photo opportunities or publicity events, but to understand the daily reality of problems she was trying to address. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi found herself at the center of attention she had never sought or wanted. The phone calls and emails that had started after her television appearance had grown into a flood of interest from media outlets, non-profit organizations, and government agencies. Everyone wanted to feature the woman who had spoken truth in a moment of manufactured conflict, who had transformed a political attack into an opportunity for genuine conversation. Publishers were offering substantial advances for expanded versions of her memoir. Documentary filmmakers wanted to follow her work at the legal aid clinic. Speaking bureaus were proposing lecture tours that could have generated more income in a month than the clinic produced in a year. But Pam turned down most of the opportunities, understanding that fame would distract from the work that actually mattered. Instead, she used the attention strategically, accepting only the invitations that could directly benefit her clients or advance policy changes that would protect other elderly Americans. She testified before congressional committees about the gaps in federal protections against elder fraud. She consulted with state attorneys general about prosecution strategies for complex financial crimes. She worked with insurance companies to develop better coverage for families dealing with dementia. The collaboration between Whoopi and Pam, two women who had begun as adversaries, gradually evolved into something neither had expected. Whoopi's media platform, combined with Pam's legal expertise, created opportunities to address elder fraud in ways that neither could have achieved alone. They appeared together at conferences and congressional hearings, their unlikely partnership demonstrating that shared commitment to solving problems could transcend political differences. 6 months after their confrontational television interview, they announced the formation of the Elder Protection Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to preventing financial crimes against seniors and supporting families dealing with dementia care. The foundation combined direct legal services with media education, policy advocacy, with practical support for caregivers. It represented a new model for addressing complex social problems, one that emphasized collaboration over conflict, solutions over blame. The success of their partnership surprised political observers who had expected their relationship to remain adversarial. But both women had been changed by their encounter in ways that made their previous roles feel constraining and artificial. Whoopi discovered that using her platform for education rather than entertainment was more fulfilling than anything she had done in decades of show business. Pam found that policy work informed by direct service was more effective than either approach alone. The Foundation's first major success came when they helped draft federal legislation that required financial institutions to implement stronger protections against elder fraud. The bill, which had been stalled in committee for years, gained momentum when Whoopi used her television show to educate viewers about the issue, while Pam provided the technical expertise needed to craft effective policy language. Their combined influence demonstrated the power of celebrity advocacy when it was grounded in genuine knowledge and personal commitment. But perhaps the most significant change was in how both women understood their own purposes and responsibilities. Whoopi realized that her decades of political commentary, however passionate and well-intentioned, had been largely performative, designed to signal virtue rather than create change. Her transformation required admitting that good intentions without informed action were insufficient, that caring about issues meant more than expressing the right opinions in the right forums. Pam discovered that her instinct to avoid publicity and work in obscurity, while admirable, had limited her ability to help the people she served. She learned to leverage media attention without being consumed by it, to use her personal story as a tool for policy change rather than allowing it to be exploited for entertainment. Her reluctant emergence into public advocacy demonstrated that authenticity could be more powerful than polish when addressing genuine problems. The partnership also revealed something important about the nature of political discourse in America. The artificial divisions that dominated media coverage often obscured shared values and common concerns. When people focused on solving specific problems rather than scoring ideological points, they discovered that their differences were less important than their similarities. Whoopi and Pam's collaboration became a model for productive engagement across political divides. As their work together expanded, both women began to understand that their initial confrontation had been a blessing in disguise. The television interview that had seemed like a disaster had actually created space for genuine conversation about issues that mattered more than political positioning. Their mutual transformation demonstrated that conflict could be productive when it led to understanding rather than escalation, when it opened hearts rather than hardening positions. The Elder Protection Foundation grew rapidly, attracting support from unexpected sources. Technology companies donated resources for developing fraud detection software. Law schools established clinical programs focused on elder law. Medical schools began including elder fraud awareness in their curricula. The Foundation's approach, which combined direct service with systemic change, attracted professionals who wanted to contribute their expertise to addressing complex social problems. But the Foundation's most important achievement was less tangible than legislative victories or program expansions. It demonstrated that genuine change was possible when people were willing to admit their mistakes, learn from their opponents, and focus on shared humanity rather than ideological differences. Whoopi and Pam's transformation from adversaries to allies became a symbol of hope for a country that seemed increasingly divided by politics and unable to address common challenges. Their story resonated with people who were tired of manufactured outrage and performative conflict, who wanted to see their leaders and media figures address real problems with serious solutions. The Foundation's success proved that audiences were hungry for content that informed rather than inflamed, that educated rather than entertained, that brought people together rather than driving them apart. As the second phase of their partnership began to take shape, both women understood that they had stumbled into something much larger than either had planned. What had started as a personal reconciliation had become a new model for public engagement, one that prioritized substance over style, collaboration over competition, and genuine service over political advantage. The work was just beginning, but the foundation they had built was solid enough to support whatever came next. 2 years later, on a crisp October morning in Washington, D.C., Margaret Bondi sat in the front row of a Senate hearing room, her eyes clear and focused in a way they hadn't been for months. The experimental treatment that the Elder Protection Foundation had helped fund was working, not curing her Alzheimer's, but slowing its progression enough to give her family precious additional time together. Beside her sat Whoopi Goldberg, no longer the confrontational television host, but a woman transformed by purpose, holding Margaret's hand as they waited for the hearing to begin. The Senate Committee on Aging was convening to discuss the most comprehensive elder protection legislation in American history, a bill that had grown directly from the Foundation's work and the unlikely partnership between two women who had once been bitter adversaries. The legislation represented everything they had learned about the intersection of healthcare, financial security, and family responsibility, codifying protections that would affect millions of American families facing the challenges of aging. Pam Bondi entered the hearing room with a thick folder of case studies and legal briefs, her role as the Foundation's chief legal counsel having evolved far beyond anything she had imagined when she first started the small clinic in Clearwater. The attention that had followed her television confrontation with Whoopi had initially felt like an unwelcome distraction, but she had learned to channel that visibility into legislative change that her quiet legal work could never have achieved alone. The transformation in both women's lives had been gradual but profound. Whoopi had discovered that her decades of political commentary, however passionate, had been largely performative until she began focusing on specific problems that required sustained attention rather than quick reactions. Her television show had evolved from a platform for ideological conflict into a resource for practical information, featuring segments on Medicare navigation, fraud prevention, and caregiver support that attracted audiences seeking solutions. Rather than entertainment, the change hadn't been without cost. Some longtime viewers had criticized the shift away from political controversy, and ratings had initially declined as the show focused more on education than entertainment. But the audience that remained was more engaged and active, translating what they learned into community action and policy advocacy. Whoopi had discovered that influence measured by impact was more satisfying than influence measured by attention. Pam's evolution had been equally dramatic, but in the opposite direction. The woman who had preferred working in obscurity had learned to leverage public attention for maximum benefit to her clients and causes. She had become skilled at navigating media interviews and congressional testimony, using her platform to amplify the voices of people who would never have access to such forums on their own. The legal aid clinic in Clearwater had expanded into a network of offices across Florida, then into a national model that other states were replicating. But the growth had been carefully managed to preserve the personal attention that made the work effective. Pam insisted that every office maintain the same ratio of lawyers to clients, ensuring that the human connection that made her work meaningful wouldn't be lost to bureaucratic efficiency. The most significant change had been in how both women understood the relationship between personal experience and public policy. Whoopi's comfortable distance from the problems she discussed had been replaced by intimate knowledge gained through direct involvement with families navigating elder care. She had learned to speak from experience rather than ideology, her commentary grounded in specific cases rather than abstract principles. Pam had discovered that her individual legal work, however dedicated, could only help one family at a time, while systemic problems required systemic solutions. Her reluctant embrace of public advocacy had multiplied her impact exponentially, creating changes that would benefit people she would never meet, but whose struggles she understood intimately. The Senate hearing represented the culmination of their shared education about the complexity of aging in America. The legislation they were supporting addressed not just elder fraud, but the broader infrastructure needed to support an aging population with dignity and security. It included provisions for Medicare expansion to cover experimental dementia treatments, federal funding for legal aid clinics specializing in elder law, and new criminal penalties for financial crimes targeting seniors. Senator Patricia Williams, the committee chair, opened the hearing by acknowledging the unusual circumstances that had brought the issue to national attention. The confrontation between Whoopi and Pam on The View had been replayed countless times, but not for its entertainment value. Instead, it had become a case study in how authentic human emotion could cut through political noise to create space for genuine problem solving. The first witness was Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a geriatrician whose research on Alzheimer's treatment had been funded by the Elder Protection Foundation. Her testimony focused on the medical aspects of the legislation, particularly the provisions that would make experimental treatments accessible to families regardless of their financial resources. She described the cruel irony of a healthcare system that could diagnose progressive diseases with precision, but couldn't provide the treatments that might slow their advance. Dr. Rodriguez's presentation included video testimonials from patients who had benefited from foundation-funded treatments, including Margaret Bondi. The footage showed Margaret painting watercolor landscapes during one of her clearer periods, her artistic ability returning as the medication helped organize her confused thoughts. The image of an elderly woman reclaiming pieces of herself through medical intervention was more powerful than any statistical analysis of treatment efficacy. The second witness was James Chen, a former FBI agent who now directed the Foundation's fraud investigation unit. His testimony revealed the scope of elder fraud in America, presenting evidence that financial crimes against seniors represented a multi-billion-dollar industry that operated with virtual impunity due to inadequate legal protections and enforcement resources. Chen's presentation included recordings of actual scam calls, demonstrating the sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that made elderly Americans particularly vulnerable. He explained how scammers researched their targets through social media and public records, crafting personalized approaches that exploited specific vulnerabilities like social isolation or cognitive decline. The most compelling part of Chen's testimony was his description of the emotional damage that extended far beyond financial loss. Victims often experience profound shame and depression, blaming themselves for being fooled rather than recognizing that they had been targeted by professional criminals. Families were torn apart by disagreements about financial responsibility and decision-making capacity, relationships destroyed by betrayal and mistrust. When Pam was called to testify, she approached the witness table with the same quiet confidence she had displayed during her confrontation with Whoopi. But her testimony was structured differently than typical congressional presentations. Instead of beginning with policy recommendations or statistical evidence, she started with a story about Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, an 85-year-old client, who had lost her life savings to a romance scam. Mrs. Patterson had been widowed for 3 years when she met someone online who claimed to be a retired engineer working overseas. Over 6 months, he had cultivated a relationship through daily phone calls and emails, learning about her deceased husband, her children who lived far away, and her financial situation. When he claimed to need money for a medical emergency, she had wired him her entire retirement account without question. Pam's description of Mrs. Patterson's case illustrated the intersection of social isolation, technological vulnerability, and financial exploitation that characterized modern elder fraud. The scammer had studied his victim carefully, providing exactly the companionship and attention she craved, while gradually building toward his financial request. By the time Mrs. Patterson realized she had been deceived, the money was gone, and the emotional damage was irreversible. The case also demonstrated the inadequacy of existing legal remedies. The scammer operated from another country using untraceable communication methods, making prosecution virtually impossible. Mrs. Patterson's bank had no obligation to investigate suspicious transfers, and law enforcement lacked the resources to pursue international financial crimes involving individual victims. The legal system that should have protected her had instead left her completely vulnerable. Pam explained how the Foundation's comprehensive approach had helped Mrs. Patterson rebuild her life. The legal aid clinic had negotiated with creditors to prevent her from losing her home. The counseling program had addressed her depression and shame. The advocacy unit had worked with her bank to implement better security procedures that might prevent future victims from experiencing similar losses. But the most important intervention had been connecting Mrs. Patterson with other scam victims who had formed a support group. The isolation that had made her vulnerable to the original scam was replaced by relationships with people who understood her experience without judgment. The group had become a source of healing that no legal remedy or financial assistance could provide. Pam's testimony demonstrated how the Foundation's work had evolved beyond individual case representation into a comprehensive response to elder fraud that addressed its root causes as well as its symptoms. The legal aid clinics provided immediate assistance to victims, but the education programs prevented crimes before they occurred. The policy advocacy created systemic changes that protected all elderly Americans, not just those who could afford legal representation. When Senator Williams asked about the financial sustainability of the Foundation's model, Pam's response revealed how much her thinking had changed since her days as a solo practitioner, struggling to pay her mother's medical bills. The Foundation had developed diverse funding streams that included government contracts, corporate partnerships, and individual donations. But its most valuable resource was the volunteer network of professionals who contributed their expertise pro bono. The Foundation had discovered that many lawyers, accountants, social workers, and healthcare providers were eager to volunteer their skills for meaningful work. But they needed organizational infrastructure to channel their efforts effectively. By providing that infrastructure, the Foundation had multiplied its impact far beyond what its paid staff could achieve alone. Whoopi's testimony focused on the role of media education in preventing elder fraud and supporting family caregivers. She described how The View had evolved from a political commentary show into a resource for practical information about aging, healthcare, and financial security. The transformation had been driven by viewer response to content that provided useful information rather than ideological entertainment. The show's elder fraud awareness segments had generated thousands of calls to the Foundation's hotline, both from potential victims seeking help and from family members who had learned to recognize warning signs. The caregiver support segments had connected isolated families with resources and communities they never knew existed. The policy education segments had motivated viewers to contact their representatives about specific legislation, rather than simply expressing general political frustrations. Whoopi's presentation included clips from recent shows that demonstrated the evolution in her approach to television. Instead of the confrontational interviews that had once defined her style, she now conducted conversations that prioritized information over entertainment, substance over sensation. The format was less dramatic, but more useful, creating content that viewers referenced and shared rather than simply consuming and forgetting. She also testified about the personal transformation that had resulted from her involvement with the foundation. Learning about elder fraud and dementia care had required her to admit ignorance about issues that affected millions of Americans, forcing her to approach topics with humility rather than assumed expertise. The education had been uncomfortable, but necessary, revealing how her celebrity and wealth had insulated her from realities that ordinary families navigated daily. The most powerful moment of Whoopi's testimony came when she acknowledged the privilege that had allowed her to remain ignorant about elder care issues until her confrontation with Pam forced her to confront them directly. She described the guilt of realizing that she had spent decades discussing political issues while remaining uninformed about practical problems that her platform could have addressed more effectively. But rather than dwelling on regret, Whoopi focused on the opportunities that awareness had created. Her celebrity connections had opened doors for the foundation that years of traditional advocacy might never have achieved. Corporate executives, who wouldn't have taken meetings with social workers, were eager to discuss partnerships with someone they recognized from television. Politicians who ignored policy experts made time for conversations with media personalities. Whoopi had learned to leverage her celebrity strategically, using her recognition to advance the foundation's work while ensuring that attention focused on the issues rather than her personality. The balance required constant vigilance, but the results demonstrated that celebrity advocacy could be effective when it was grounded in genuine knowledge and sustained commitment. Margaret Bondi's testimony was brief but profound. Her words came slowly, with the careful deliberation of someone whose cognitive capacity fluctuated, but whose essential personality remained intact. She spoke about the experience of losing pieces of herself to Alzheimer's while watching her daughter sacrifice everything to provide care that insurance wouldn't cover. Margaret's description of the experimental treatment that had given her additional clarity was delivered with the precision of her former legal career. She explained the specific ways that the medication had improved her memory and cognitive function, providing testimony that no medical expert could have delivered with equivalent authenticity. Her presence at the hearing demonstrated the human potential that was preserved when families had access to appropriate medical interventions. But Margaret's most important contribution was her perspective on the relationship between individual dignity and social support. She described the humiliation of needing help with basic daily activities, the fear of becoming a burden to loved ones, and the relief of discovering that her condition didn't diminish her worth as a human being. Her words reminded the committee that behind every policy discussion were real people whose lives were affected by legislative decisions. The hearing concluded with testimony from Sarah Kim, a former elder fraud victim who had become one of the foundation's most effective advocates. Her transformation from victim to activist illustrated the broader theme of redemption and purpose that characterized the foundation's work. Sarah had lost her retirement savings to a fake investment scheme, but had channeled her anger into preventing others from experiencing similar devastation. Sarah's testimony revealed the psychological sophistication of modern fraud schemes and the vulnerability of elderly Americans who had grown up in an era when trust was more common and technology was less complex. She described the shame and self-blame that characterized most victims' responses, emotions that prevented many people from seeking help or reporting crimes. But Sarah also testified about the empowerment that came from transforming personal tragedy into public service. Her work with the foundation had given meaning to her suffering, creating purpose from pain in ways that no financial recovery could have achieved. Her story demonstrated that victims could become advocates, that personal experience could become public expertise, that individual healing could contribute to collective change. The committee's questioning revealed the bipartisan support that the legislation had attracted. Republicans and Democrats found common ground in protecting elderly Americans from financial exploitation, recognizing that fraud affected families regardless of political affiliation. The Foundation's approach, which emphasized practical solutions over ideological positions, had created space for cooperation that was rare in contemporary politics. Senator Williams announced that the committee would vote on the legislation the following week, with passage virtually guaranteed given the unanimous support it had received during the hearing. But she also acknowledged that legislative success was only the beginning of the work needed to address elder fraud and dementia care comprehensively. The real test would be implementation, ensuring that new legal protections translated into practical assistance for families facing these challenges. The Foundation's model provided a framework for combining government resources with private expertise, but scaling that approach nationally would require sustained commitment from multiple stakeholders. As the hearing concluded and participants gathered their materials, the transformation in Whoopi and Pam's relationship was evident to everyone present. The two women who had begun as adversaries now worked together with the seamless coordination of longtime partners, their different skills and perspectives combining to create something neither could have achieved alone. Their collaboration had demonstrated that political differences could be transcended when people focused on shared values rather than ideological positions. Their partnership had shown that media attention could be channeled toward constructive purposes when celebrities used their platforms responsibly. Their success had proved that individual transformation could create systemic change when personal growth was directed toward public service. 6 months after the legislation passed, the Elder Protection Foundation announced its most ambitious initiative yet, a national network of community-based elder services that would provide comprehensive support for aging Americans and their families. The program would combine the legal aid clinics that had started Pam's work with the education and advocacy programs that had emerged from Whoopi's media platform. The initiative represented everything they had learned about addressing complex social problems effectively. It emphasized prevention as much as intervention, education as much as enforcement, community support as much as individual assistance. The model recognized that elder fraud and dementia care were symptoms of broader social isolation and systemic inadequacy that required comprehensive responses. The announcement was made not at a press conference or media event, but at the memory care facility where Margaret Bondi lived. The setting was intentional, reminding everyone present that the work was ultimately about real people facing real challenges, rather than abstract policy discussions or career advancement. Margaret's condition had continued to improve slowly under the experimental treatment protocol, giving her family precious additional time together while demonstrating the potential of medical interventions that the Foundation had helped make accessible. Her presence at the announcement represented both personal triumph and systemic change, individual healing and collective progress. As Whoopi and Pam addressed the small gathering of families, caregivers and advocates, their words carried the weight of personal experience rather than political positioning. They spoke about lessons learned from mistakes made, about growth that came from admitting ignorance, about the possibility of finding purpose in unexpected places. Their story had become larger than either woman's individual transformation. It had become a demonstration of what was possible when people chose collaboration over conflict, when they prioritized substance over style, when they directed their energy towards solving problems rather than scoring points. The foundation's work continued to expand, attracting support from unexpected sources and creating partnerships that crossed traditional boundaries. But its most important achievement remained the model it provided for productive engagement across political and social divides, proof that shared humanity could overcome artificial divisions when people focused on common challenges rather than manufactured differences. 3 years after their confrontational television interview, Whoopi and Pam stood together at the White House as the president signed the Elder Protection Act into law. The ceremony was attended by families whose lives had been touched by the foundation's work, advocates who had joined their efforts, and policymakers who had learned to approach complex problems with the humility and persistence that effective solutions required. The legislation represented just one milestone in an ongoing effort to address the challenges of aging in America. But it also symbolized something more fundamental: the possibility of transformation at both personal and societal levels when people were willing to admit their limitations, learn from their opponents, and focus their efforts on work that mattered more than their own recognition or advancement. Margaret Bondi sat in the front row during the signing ceremony, her eyes bright with comprehension as she watched her daughter receive recognition for work that had grown from love and necessity into national policy. The experimental treatment had given her family additional time together, but perhaps more importantly, it had demonstrated that hope was justified when people refused to accept inadequate solutions to solvable problems. As the ceremony concluded and participants moved to a reception celebrating the legislation's passage, Whoopi and Pam found themselves in a quiet corner of the White House, surrounded by the history and possibility that the building represented. Their conversation was interrupted by a young woman who introduced herself as a law student, inspired by their partnership to pursue elder law as a career. The student's presence reminded both women that their work had created ripple effects, extending far beyond what they could measure or control. Their transformation from adversaries to allies had inspired others to bridge divides in their own lives and work. Their collaboration had demonstrated that change was possible when people chose growth over pride, service over self-interest, purpose over comfort. Standing in that historic space, surrounded by evidence of what dedicated people could accomplish. When they worked together toward common goals, Whoopi and Pam understood that their journey was far from over. The Elder Protection Foundation would continue to grow and evolve, addressing new challenges as America's population aged and social needs changed. But regardless of what the future held, they had already achieved something remarkable. They had proven that authentic human connection could transcend political differences, that personal transformation could create social change, that individual healing could contribute to collective progress. Their story had become a testament to the possibility of redemption and growth, a demonstration that it was never too late to admit mistakes, learn from opponents, and redirect energy toward work that truly mattered. The foundation they had built would continue long after both women were gone, but their most important legacy wasn't organizational or legislative. It was the example they had provided of what became possible when people chose wisdom over winning, when they prioritized service over status, when they measured success by impact rather than recognition. As they left the White House that evening, walking together toward whatever challenges and opportunities awaited them, Whoopi and Pam carried with them the knowledge that their accidental partnership had become something neither could have planned or predicted. Their transformation from adversaries to allies had demonstrated that hope was justified, that change was possible, that the future could be different from the past when people were willing to do the hard work of growth and service. Their story would continue, not because cameras were rolling or audiences were watching, but because the work they had started was larger than either woman individually, more important than their personal recognition. and more necessary than their comfort or convenience. They had found their purpose in an unexpected place, and that purpose would sustain them regardless of what came next. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.